Hey everyone, it's Colin. How's it going? So here's something you don't see every day. So this thing crossed my path recently and I just couldn't say no. Unfortunately, it's not new in box, but it's fairly complete in box. The only thing that I think is really missing is just the original packing materials. While I'm going to go through and try to restore this machine, get it fixed up as best I can within reason, ultimately it's going to end up out at the Free Geek Twin Cities thrift store. I don't really need to keep this for my own use. I've got a similar model already. So we're just going to keep that in mind as I go through and try to get this machine working again. Also, fair warning, this video is going to be fairly long and pretty rambling, so if you're in the mood for something short and concise and just gets to the point right away, you probably want to skip this episode. Okay, before we start looking at the computer itself, there's some interesting accessories and stuff in the box that I kind of want to go through first. So before we get into the contents of the box, I actually want to take a look at some of the stuff on the outside because it tells an interesting tale. This is like the original, I guess, config label for this machine. It's the PowerBook 170. Again, very standard model, 4 megabytes of RAM. FDHD means it includes a floppy drive and a hard drive, which all of these models did. HD, 80 megabytes. SC stands for SCSI. And then what's also interesting is it came with not just System Software 701, and around the time that this machine shipped, System 7 was fairly new, and it was a substantial upgrade over System 6, but also included the System 7 tune-up, which was just kind of like a bunch of patches to kind of fix some bugs and that sort of thing. Also interesting to note is this was an assembled in Ireland machine. In the early 90s when this shipped, Apple had global manufacturing, of course, and a lot of the computers that Apple manufactured and sold were actually made in the US. But for a very long time, Apple had and still has operations in Ireland where it's not just an office space, but they did manufacturing there too. And even to this day, it's still possible to get a product from Apple that was assembled in Ireland. I feel like it's becoming less and less common, but it is kind of neat to see. And then here's another couple of labels that help tell the story of this machine. The first sticker that I noticed here is this price tag. University Bookstore, get a load of this, $3,379 for this laptop. And that's actually like the educational discounted rate because the PowerBook 170, when it came out, it was the top end of Apple's PowerBook line. Basically, in the early 90s, Apple's first true laptop computers, there were 3 models, the PowerBook 100, the 140, and then the 170. This thing retailed, or at least MSRP when it launched, was somewhere around $4,500 US. So clearly there was not just some time that had passed and prices came down, but also a pretty substantial educational discount, it seems. So yeah, that's kind of it for labels on this box. We might as well start going through what's inside it. Now, unfortunately, like I said, it's missing its packing materials, which I'm kind of not surprised by. I mean, having the box in and of itself is kind of a surprise, especially since it's a laptop, because it's a laptop. What's the first thing you're going to do when you unpack it? You're probably going to throw it in like a laptop bag or a briefcase or something like that. Why would you ever need the box again? But it does have some cool goodies in here, so let's go through them. So you might be wondering why this PowerBook fax data modem is a separate manual and a separate driver floppy disk. Like, why is it not included just as information in the rest of the booklets and the floppy holder and all that? That's because this was actually an optional upgrade for the computer. I mean, this was the early 90s. Not everyone had access to the internet. Not everyone needed to do faxes. So it was just something you could buy and add on to the computer, either from the factory or as an optional add-in that like a computer dealer would install later. Something I noticed is that there's no reference to the fax data modem on the box. that could have just been default with the config of the computer, but it also could have been something added on afterwards, and they just happened to keep the documentation and the floppy along with it. Either way, you know, communication and connectivity is just something we absolutely take for granted with computers these days. And even 20 years ago, having like an Ethernet port and a modem built into a laptop was just a standard feature. You wouldn't buy a computer without it. But in like 1991, 1992, yeah, not everyone needed that. A lot of people still used computers and laptops as just these standalone devices. So the system disks, I mean, obviously if your hard drive failed or your OS got corrupted or whatever, you'd need a way to reinstall it. So they'd give you a full set of floppies here. And so the entirety of System 7 came on. There's 4 floppies down here. Some of these are kind of doubled up, as you can see. And then there's another 2 up top here for install 1 and install 2. And these all include various things, like this one's disk tools. And this is one that you could boot off of, and we'll probably end up using this disk later to like reformat the hard drive and get the installation started of the operating system. And then other components of the OS that in some cases were optional and other cases were mandatory came on these additional disks. So you had install 1 and install 2 for kind of the core components. And then you could add things like fonts, and then printing is going to be like some drivers and support for Apple's printers. Tidbits is just miscellaneous stuff. Probably like software and extensions specific to laptops or specific computer models. And, you know, it's just, you'd go through the floppy disks and the computer would ask you to put the right one in the drive at the right time and it would load off of it. I mean, again, that's something that we're totally haven't had to deal with in forever. I mean, you know, installing Windows, well, most people just do that off of a USB flash drive if you're doing a fresh install. But even for the last 20 plus years, I mean, you just boot right off of the CD and load everything straight away. Installing software, and especially the OS, way back in the 90s was a much more, shall we say, hands-on affair. The thing that really kind of strikes me the most out of all the documentation included with the machine is these guides in these manuals. I mean, obviously a thin, like, getting started guide like this makes a lot of sense, right? Like, you know, how do you plug the computer in? How do you turn it on? Just the basic use kind of stuff, right? But what really gets me is these books. So you've got a getting started with your Macintosh, and this is not necessarily going to be laptop specific. This is about, you know, using the computer, using the Mac OS, I should say, in general. But there's 2 things about this that we just don't see anymore. First is, this is like a spiral bound book, meaning it's intended for you to go back into it frequently. They did this sort of binding for a reason. They could have gone with like a really cheap, you know, perfect binding where it's just glue down the middle, but those books generally aren't too conducive to being used frequently. So by going with the spiral bound, they're intending for this to be kind of a reference guide that you can go back to at any point if you need it. The other thing is the contents of this book. Like these pages, it shows you how to use the mouse. Everybody these days knows how to use a mouse. We're at a point where pretty much everybody knows how to use a computer, at least to a basic extent. There were plenty of people back in the early 90s who had never used a computer before, and this particular machine could have been the very first computer they had ever used in their entire life. And so learning how to do things like point and click and drag and double click, I mean, they're teaching you just stuff that we kind of laugh at these days because it's so, I don't know, intrinsic to our knowledge now. But back then, no, you absolutely needed guides like this just to teach people how to use computers. And then going even deeper in, you've got this MacUser's guide. This book basically teaches you everything you need to know about the computer and how to use it, like from the operating system perspective and even some of the basic applications. Like literally everything, because you couldn't really get on the internet and Google it back then, right? There were no knowledge-based articles or YouTube tutorials or anything like that, unless you had someone that you knew that could hands-on teach you this kind of stuff, or a very patient like computer dealer or whatever who would sit there with you. You needed a book. And so this was just included in the box with every computer, and PC manufacturers did this too. This wasn't just a Mac thing. When was the last time you ever got any sort of documentation anywhere near this like exhaustive about a piece of technology that you've bought? It's been a very long time. And you know what? Even though like we all know what's in this book, it's still kind of fun to just page through it and see how they teach you to do stuff and the language that they use. There's very simple language in here. It's not very technical at all. And there's a lot of like reassuring language that I've found in these books that try to keep people comfortable, because computers back then, I mean, they were pretty daunting, especially if it's a brand new thing to you that you've never used before. All right, next up, let's take a look at some of the accessories that came in the box with the computer. This is a little holder, and it's not used, some double-sided tape on the back, and this is for holding the external microphone. It looks like actually this is an extra one, because I'm seeing one of those holders already in this package. I haven't seen an unused one of these in forever, but I've never seen this clip one before. But I mean, it kind of explains, they came with a pretty decent length of cable on them. So the clip, you know, maybe the intention was for you to be able to wear it, like if you're doing, I don't know, voice memos or whatever. I mean, Macs were definitely multimedia machines, like by design, but it wasn't until later in the 90s that people started doing like heavy duty audio production kind of stuff. And it wasn't until even later on that people started doing, you know, video, like rudimentary video conferencing kind of things. So generally, if you were going to use a mic on a Mac in the early 90s, it was to do kind of quick little voice memo type of things. But I mean, clearly they wanted you to get the best audio quality you could, so they included a wearable clip version for this mic. All right, one more accessory that was in the box, and then we'll start looking at the computer itself. I haven't seen one of these in a long time, but I definitely remember using them. This is called a Local Talk adapter. Local Talk was a more basic serial-based networking protocol that Apple had from the late 80s and through the 90s. It predates Ethernet, at least the appearance of Ethernet on Macs, but it was also a much less expensive and simpler way to network Mac computers together. The big thing that this was used for, other than just sharing files between computers, but was also sharing printers. And so you could get one of these simple dongles. It basically plugged into one of the serial ports on the back of the Mac and then broke out into what looks like a pair of phone jacks. The idea is a Local Talk network was going to be daisy chained. So you'd have like an input and an output, and it used regular phone cables. In fact, you only needed, I believe, 2 wires in order to make Local Talk work. So I've heard over the years some really interesting stories about people using like the spare phone wiring in their house. Like if their house was wired with 4 conductor phone wiring, but they only had 1 phone line, so it took just 2 of the wires, like red and green, they could then repurpose the yellow and black wires in their phone cable for Local Talk, like without having to pull new wiring throughout their house. But the idea is, you know, you'd have one computer's cable coming into here, and then, you know, this would be connected to a computer, and then maybe the output would go into another one of these adapters plugged into a printer. And that way both computers or multiple computers could share the same printer, and you could share files between the computers. What's interesting about this particular adapter, and what makes it a little bit different than some of the ones I've seen, is this on-off switch on here. And it took me a second to realize what this was for. Local Talk networks that used the phone cables required termination on either end of the cable. And that's a long kind of electrical engineering explanation that I'm just not going to get into this time. But basically, the first device in the chain and the last device in the chain, whatever unused ports you had on these adapters, you had to stick a little terminator in, and it was basically a phone plug that had like a resistor wired between the two wires. This one basically has a terminator built into it, which is nice because otherwise you'd lose those little terminators and you'd need one, of course, at the time when you lost it, and so everything was going haywire. You can just turn that terminator on and off through this little switch. These were actually fairly inexpensive back in the day, at least far less expensive than getting into Ethernet or token ring networking. I'd like to say, memory serves, these were only like 25 to 30 bucks each, and just plug straight into the Mac. You didn't need any special cards or adapters or anything other than just these dongles and some phone cables. All right, so first impressions after taking the computer itself out of the box is that it's really clean. Whoever had this machine before obviously took very good care of it. There's just a little bit of dust, but that's kind of to be expected considering its age and how long it's been sitting around. I don't think that this machine traveled very much, just because there's like no scrapes or scratches or bumps or wear or anything on it. And even if it did travel a lot, taking care of machines like this made a lot of sense. I mean, you saw the price tag on the box. Like, would you really beat up a computer that you paid that much money for? So people generally got proper carrying cases and bags and stuff to put their laptop computers in. They also generally only had the laptop as their primary machine. So instead of being like a second computer, and if it breaks, oh, whoops, at least they still have another computer to use. Yeah, this would have been it. So they had a vested interest in taking as good of care of it as they could. I'm going to try and open the screen carefully. This is the first time I've opened the machine just because there's the possibility of brittle plastics. And yeah, minimal yellowing of the keyboard for whatever reason on these PowerBook 100, and I've also seen it on the 500 series. Just the different types of plastic that they used. The keycaps tend to turn yellow a lot quicker than the rest of the case. In this case, they're very similar shades, so this thing was, in the very least, I think, kept in a good location. One bummer that I am seeing over here, though, is, again, kind of the sign of brittle plastic. There's a crack in the casing over here, and I don't think that was due to wear. I think that's just a function of time, sad to say. Of course, the thing that can absolutely make or break just how restorable this computer is going to be the condition of the battery. It's got the battery cover. Yeah, it looks like the battery itself is still in here. If this thing leaked badly enough, it can end up on the motherboard, and I've seen it ruin computers completely. Survey says no leakage at all. That's not common. Usually these leak. And what's even nicer is that the little plastic tab on the cover is still intact. The latch that keeps it in place. If these batteries leak but not too badly, you can actually detach the outer cover from the battery, which is something I've talked about before in other laptop videos. I really liked it when manufacturers did that because inevitably a battery like this will go bad, it will leak, but being able to detach the cover means you can put it back on the computer without the battery in there and it still looks at least complete. Yeah, and a quick peek inside the battery bay, those contacts look clean. There's never been a battery that's leaked in here. That's a really good sign. And then around back, a pretty typical complement of ports for a Mac of this vintage. Power button, reset, interrupt, that's like to drop you into kind of a debug thing. It was what programmers used when writing programs or fixing bugs in their programs. A pair of serial ports, audio in and out, ADB for keyboard, mouse, accessories like that. SCSI port for an external like CD-ROM drive or hard drive, and then that optional fax data modem. Okay, and for the $1 million question, will it power on and boot? I've got the AC adapter plugged in. Let's hit the button and see what we get. Absolutely nothing at all. Well then, yeah, normally I'd at least expect to hear some kind of pop out of the speaker or some sign of life, and oftentimes on these old Macs, even just plugging the power cord in is enough to get the machine to power on, like if the battery backup is bad or anything like that, but this thing's just dead right now. I'll try a different power brick and we'll see what we get. All right, spare known good AC adapter. What do we get this time? Yep. Still a whole lot of nothing, sad to say. Best case scenario, the DC in jack on the back of the machine just needs to get resoldered since the internal battery is obviously just completely dead. It feels okay when I plug the cable into it though, so sad to say, I really suspect I've got some recapping to do on this motherboard. So I don't think it's caps, and that's because, well, I totally forgot with these models of machines, there really aren't any electrolytic caps on any of the boards, not on the CPU RAM daughter card, the main motherboard, even underneath the modem card, which I unscrewed. There's a few tantalum caps on the board, but those don't fail nearly as often as electrolytic ones do. So I think this thing not wanting to power on is due to something else. I've got the machine just loosely put back together. None of the screws are in it, but I pulled the main battery out. I can't say I've ever seen a bad main battery prevent the machine from booting or working correctly, but you know, it was the first time for everything. So I'm gonna just power it on. I've got the AC adapter connected. We'll see if maybe it wants to work this time. Well, hey, that's different. The hard drive itself does spin up, however, the heads don't move. That's what that clicking sound is. You should normally get normal hard drive clicking kinds of sounds, but that repetitive tapping sound basically means that the drive heads, well, you know what? The drive is kind of done. Let me get this machine apart and I'll show you exactly what the problem is. I was hoping I wouldn't run into any of these, but well, this standoff, I'm trying to get this screw out. When I turn the screw, the standoff underneath it just spins. So this plastic post, I'm going to have to glue that one back together as best I can. So this is interesting. The drive says it's a 40 meg unit. I could have sworn the box said 80 megs. Very interesting. I am not surprised, however, to see that this is a Connor drive, because these Connor drives are probably the worst when it comes to this particular issue. Although my understanding is that some of the Quantum drives that were from this same era, the 2.5-inch SCSI drives, well, they exhibit the same problem. Let's pop the cover on this drive since we kind of have nothing to lose at this point, and I can show you exactly what's going on. So normally when you work on hard drives, whenever you take the top cover off, you need to work on them in a very clean environment, specifically like a clean room environment or a very carefully designed filtered air type of setup underneath a laminar flow hood, that sort of thing, because the data density on the platters is so high that even a little speck of dust can be enough to destroy data that's already on the drive. However, the data density on drives like this thing's only 40 megabytes. That density is so low that you don't have as big of concerns. Now, the other thing is, I'm going to more or less say that this drive is kind of a write-off, so I'm willing to open this as a way to show you what's going on. Some people have actually managed to repair these drives and they work again. And I've actually done that myself. However, I wouldn't trust a drive that's been opened in just a regular environment and repaired like this to be kind of a permanent fix. I would do it only really for data recovery purposes. I know some of you are going to disagree with just opening a drive in open air. That's fine. Best course of action would be to try and find a proper data recovery facility that can do this. However, try to find a data recovery facility that can work on a hard drive that's 30 years old, that'll have the technology to be able to even read data off of this, that sort of thing. That's going to be difficult and very expensive. So I think it's worth the DIY approach, at least sometimes, if you can. Now, obviously, in a non-climate controlled or air controlled environment, you're going to want to try and minimize the sources of dust if you can. Because otherwise, it gets a little bit more risky. And I'm already starting to see one problem, and that is with this gasket around the outside, but we'll take a closer look at that when I get the cover off this. All right, so very carefully open this up. And you can see the inside of the drive. And this one's got 2 platters. And so being a 40 megabyte drive, the platters are double-sided. There's only 10 megabytes per side of each platter. So very low data density. Obviously, you don't want to get this thing dusty inside it. However, I know some people may disagree with opening a drive like this just in open air. And again, this drive, I'm going to consider kind of a goner, so I'm willing to do it. But push comes to shove, I have seen repairs like this done successfully. All right, I've got the screws taken out of the upper magnet here, and then the trick is trying to lift this thing away. There are actually 2 problems that can happen with these drives. The first one is actually very simple in that you've got this gasket around the cover that seals the drive closed. That gasket is made of a rubbery kind of material, and like a lot of 30-plus-year-old rubbery material, it can kind of turn to goo. And in some cases, that stuff liquefies to the point where it physically contaminates the drive platters themselves. There's really no recovering from that if that's the case. You can't clean these platters off physically without damaging them further. So if you get any of the sticky cover goo on the platters, the drive is definitely toast. That is not what happened in this case. What you can notice down here is that the drive is in its what they call parked position, where it's all the way towards the middle of the platters. There's actually no data in this like inner ring kind of area. And down here is a little arm coming off of the armature. So that little bit of rubber inside there comes into contact with this metal bit on the end of the arm and serves as a bump stop. So basically, as the drive head is flying back and forth, if the voice coil tries to make it go too far, it'll just bump into this piece of rubber instead of letting the head keep going and crash into like the center of the platter or anything like that. The problem, of course, is this is also kind of a rubbery material, and over time it gets sticky. The voice coil doesn't have a whole ton of torque to it. It's good at moving the head really fast back and forth, but it's not strong. It can't pull the head away from the stickiness of this rubber bumper very well. It's through like that little cutout that the end of the armature hits that rubber bump stop. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a piece of Kapton tape covering over that little window, and that should be enough to keep the arm from actually touching the rubber part and getting stuck. We'll put the drive back together. Hopefully that'll get it working. So what about these standoffs where the drive mounting bracket went in? Obviously the plastic completely broke off of both of these. And normally you've got these little brass standoffs that sit within the plastic, and that's, these threaded inserts is where the screws for the bracket ties into. There's not much left. Well, what I'm going to do is a semi-temporary / semi-permanent, somewhere in the middle kind of repair, where there's still some plastic left in this standoff, right? I've had experience replacing these with 3D printed brackets on the display assembly, and what I've found is you can actually melt the threaded inserts into place. Now, I don't have replacement brackets for these modeled up, and I haven't seen any online. That'll be something that I'll need to do eventually. For this repair, though, I'm going to try just melting those threaded brass inserts into what's left of these standoffs and see how well that works. If it doesn't work, it's no big deal. You can always remove that threaded insert and mill away this plastic standoff and then put like a 3D printed bracket in its place, glue them in place. But I'm curious if, with what plastic I have left, if that's not going to work. And the trick for actually doing this is to use a soldering iron. Let's see if I can get this to work out properly here. That actually seems to work really nicely. Try and get this other one going. Cool. Let's try to get that bracket back in place. All right, the drive has been repaired. Power cable plugged in. Let's go. Ooh, that pattern's interesting. Although that could just be because the PRAM battery might be dead. Oh! Yeah, check it! All right. See, I just did a real quick cleanup of any personal files that were on this machine. There actually weren't very many, and I will still absolutely be wiping this drive. That'll actually be the next task, but I just wanted to show you now. Yeah, it boots. This machine, it powers on and boots from its own hard drive. So you absolutely can, again, in quotation marks, repair these drives. Do I trust this drive? Absolutely not. As just a retro item for tinkering, playing old games, whatever, the reliability of the drive doesn't matter. You're not going to use a computer like this for daily tasks and storing important information anymore. So if the data is priceless, absolutely try to seek out some sort of data recovery company that can work with like retro drives like that, but I'm just not aware of very many. I still can't explain the whole 80 megabytes on the box, 40 megabytes in the computer discrepancy, but hey, let's get a disk tools floppy and see if the floppy drive works, and then we can wipe the drive. So I don't want to test the floppy drive with one of those good, like in-box original Apple floppies, so I've got System 7 disk tools on a floppy I made myself. If the drive decides to eat the disk, at least it's eating a generic one. I didn't hear it try to seek that disk at all, and it came back with the whole, disk is damaged. Think the floppy drive is probably bad or needs some service. Let's eject this one and try another disk just to make sure. So here's like disk 1 of the System 7 install set that I made up. Let's just see if it can read this. Oh, it can. Says my disk tools floppy bad? It sees all the files. Maybe I'll get lucky and not have to repair the floppy drive. Let's try the disk tools disk again. No. Okay. So, But it worked with the other disc, so I'm guessing this one might just be corrupted or something. What do you say, spin the wheel of death and try the original disk tools disk? If it eats this disk, I've got another complete set of these floppies that I'll throw in instead. So don't worry. Yeah, and it reads that one. Okay, fair enough. So my other disk tools disk is bad. Let's restart up off of that one. It's going to spit it out. Pop it back in. Yeah, it's totally booting off the floppy. Okay, cool. So you may be noticing that this display looks kind of yellow. I think that's a combination of two things. One, the backlights. These are compact fluorescent, the CCFL, cold cathode fluorescent backlight tubes, and they just kind of go that way over time. The other thing is, I don't actually ever remember these displays being like perfectly white backlights, even when they were new anyway. So it's not horrible, and actually the contrast on this display is really nice. And I should also note that this display thankfully doesn't suffer from a very common problem that affects these machines. It's called like tunnel vision is kind of what the community has named it. I've talked about it more in another PowerBook video if you want to go check that one out. But basically the seal between the two panes of glass in the LCD panel fails over time, and you get this weird like effect where the corners start to darken as the display gets used until you get like nothing viewable. So that's why they call it tunnel vision. This one doesn't seem to be experiencing that at all, which is really nice. This is the higher end active matrix display. That was really the primary difference between the PowerBook 170 and the 140, which was kind of the mid-range model. The 140 had a passive matrix display, which was not as nice to look at because the refresh rate was really, really low. However, those are immune to that tunnel vision problem. It only suffers on the active matrix display. So machines like the PowerBook 170 and the 180 especially is susceptible to it. This one looks really good and it's nice and bright. So this is a very good LCD panel. All right, so the drive was successfully wiped. I'm gonna go ahead and power the machine off and then get the screws put back into the bottom of it. And then we'll get a fresh OS installed on here. Something told me I wasn't quite done with this machine yet. See this gap in the rear display housing and the hinge? Yeah, that means that at least one of the plastic standoffs that holds the display housing together, the front and back halves, that's broken off, and it's kind of keeping this from being pulled together as tight as it should. I experienced that same problem on another very similar machine. I go into detail about how I fixed it in that video. But I'll get this display taken apart and we'll 3D print some brackets and glue them in and get it all fixed up for good. So getting this display fixed was a little bit of an ordeal in that it was difficult to try to get the screw out of the front bezel on the right side. What I ended up having to do was carefully pop the front bezel loose as best I could and then reach in with a pair of pliers to hold the brass insert inside in place so that I could unscrew the screw from the front. That allowed me to free the front bezel, and then I could get the screen itself, LCD panel, unscrewed, laid down on the keyboard and palm rest assembly, and then take out the last two screws that hold the rear display housing on. That's what the hinges mount to. And as I suspected, yep, it was the two plastic standoffs on the right side that mount to the hinge that had crumbled over time. So I got them cut down the rest of the way with a pair of flush cutters and then sanded that area smooth. I 3D printed a replacement bracket and then used some super glue with some accelerator to mount it to that rear display housing. This is special glue that I've used before that's specifically designed for work on plastics, and it's done a generally really good job. I was able to reuse that soldering iron trick to then melt the threaded inserts back into that replacement bracket, and then the rest of the display just went back together as it should. And it looks great now. The hinges feel nice and tight. The display is nice and stable. It doesn't wobble back and forth or anything like that. And as long as whoever ends up with this machine is gentle with it, that repair should last a very long time. While I had the machine apart, I also fixed this crack in the plastic. I think this actually formed due to the broken hinge standoffs in the screen. A lot of the stress of opening and closing the display is kind of in this corner since the hinges mount to the top panel. So I guess I'm not really surprised that with that hinge on the display broken, it would cause this area to flex quite a bit more than it otherwise would. And, you know, the plastics are getting brittle, so that's just where it decided to crack. I used a little bit more of the super glue with the accelerator to kind of piece this back together. Thankfully, it was a fairly clean break. I did get a bit of glue squeeze out, unfortunately. I tried to clean it up as best I can, so this doesn't look 100% cosmetically perfect, but it is holding together very strongly, and it's a far sight better than just having this big crack in the plastic that's kind of, you know, flapping there loose. So I'm glad I was able to get this sorted out as well. So the last thing left to do is deal with this battery. The machine didn't want to power on at all with this battery installed. So the easy solution is just some capped on tape over the contacts. I'll put a couple of layers on there. That way it just won't make electrical contact between the battery and the computer. The battery does add a little bit of ballast to the front of the machine so that it doesn't want to tip back, quite so easily. So since this one isn't leaking, I'm inclined to just leave it in there. If it was leaking, I would just take that cover off and slide it in. I think there are some 3D models of these batteries available, either if you want to rebuild one yourself, or if you just want to produce a dummy battery to slide in there, because it does add a little bit of structural rigidity to this front corner anyway for the plastics. But yeah, I think just taping over the contacts to make sure that it doesn't piss off the rest of the computer is going to be good to go for this one. So yeah, I'm happy with how this one turned out overall. It's not 100% perfect. I did the best I could with those plastics repairs, for example, but you know what? Overall, this thing is in really good shape now, and it's completely functional, so I'm gonna count that as a win. It'll end up going off to the Free Geek Twin Cities thrift store, so it'll end up in the hands of another retro collector or someone who maybe has never played around with an older Mac before. I'm not really sure. If you're interested in learning more about Free Geek Twin Cities, I'll include a link down in the description to a video I did about them a while back. It tells a pretty good story. Anyway, I'm also curious, do you like this particular video format? It's hard for me to find out whether people prefer these longer, potentially rambling videos that allow me to go into more detail about topics versus just kind of sticking to the facts and getting through a higher polish, kind of more edited video where it takes less time, but maybe I can't get quite as deep into detail. Let me know down in the comments what you think, if you want to see this style of video more or less frequently, or just what your thoughts are on that one. So anyway, if you like this one, I would appreciate a thumbs up. Be sure to subscribe. You can follow me on social media @thisdoesnotcomp. And as always, thanks for watching.